Welcome to Biocomputation with Max. Today is Monday, September 15th, 2025. I want to talk about a couple important subjects today: your health and independence, which are related. A couple of weeks ago, the FDA gave full approval to COVID-19 vaccine for 2025. It's recommended for the elderly and those with at least one risk factor of a severe infection. There's only one problem: a complete and total lack of evidence. This is shocking, but it's true. I'll talk this in detail. Last week, there was a Senate hearing where RFK Jr., the U.S. Health Secretary, was questioned, including regarding the firing of the Vaccine Advisory Board. In a notable exchange with Senator Mark Warner from Virginia, the issue of the lack of proper data was discussed and politicized. Next week, Trump administration plans to link the deaths of 25 children to COVID vaccines. The news broke on Friday, and shares of Pfizer and Moderna plunged by 3.9% and 7.4% respectively. The problem is, you guessed it, lack of clear evidence of what's happening with these cases, the children, and evidence for the approval. But let's review the approval situation. So the FDA withdrew the emergency authorization and provided essentially a regular authorization of the vaccine. Now, in light of the concerns about this technology in general and COVID vaccine in particular, I wanted to investigate the supporting data. Words can barely describe the horror of what I saw. The regulators have no data backing up their decisions. They appear to be playing with our lives again. You may think I'm overstating the case, or perhaps I misunderstand. I also would prefer that to be the case. I've documented the facts in an hour-long video, which is linked in the description below. It's both technical and thorough and available for all to see, although I expect few to take advantage of it. So I'm making this shorter summary. I'm not famous and my channel has a tiny audience, but that doesn't take away from the value of information I've cataloged. So I'm going to persist and provide this short summary and additional information, which, as I said, is important to our lives and well-being. Now, the facts as I interpret them are revealed by communications by the two regulatory agents of the FDA that provided this approval, with restrictions of the new Pfizer mRNA vaccine, the Pfizer's own public announcement, and clinical trial information, which is also public. In other words, basically all the information. And of course, I looked into the vaccine adverse event reporting system, VAERS data. But here I'm talking about the regulatory approval, and I've looked at all the data. You would think that the regulators would link data to the supporting information in the regulatory approval. They do link to clinical trials, but they are related to healthy children, not those for whom the vaccine is approved. As I said, the elderly and those with a risk of severe infection. And we can consider age 65 and up to be another form of risk factor. Now, the two companies involved in this approval, Pfizer and BioNTech, which are collaborating, of course, on this vaccine. The other mRNA vaccine is made by Moderna. So here the approval is for Pfizer and BioNTech, and they're going to run the necessary clinical trial later this year in a perfunctory manner, looking at the patients for whom the approval was given. You heard me correctly. Approval was given on unrelated data, while there will be a pretense of acquiring the necessary data later. Providing regulatory permissions before data is acquired is like the effect coming before cause. It's completely relativistic. The clinical trial has a laughable enrollment of 100 people, which is completely inadequate for a phase 3 trial, which it is. More precisely, this enrollment would be laughable, except that it's likely to be used to support clinical decisions as those that we're witnessing today. Now, the trial has two treatment cohorts. They're basically the elderly and those with risk factors, but there's no control group, no placebo. That means it's not a real test of risks or benefits. Also, a pivotal phase 3 clinical trial typically involves randomization, a control arm, and double blinding, meaning that only the study designers know who received treatments and who didn't. Neither the doctor nor the patients knows, double blind. Also, the measurable result, the so-called endpoint, is completely inadequate. It's simply seroresponse, production of antibodies. This doesn't always correlate with severity of disease or even recovery. It's a modest predictor of response, especially in light of the variation of the strains. So in any case, severe cases of COVID involve an overactive immune system, not an overactive immune system. This is another reason why creating a vaccine for COVID struck me as a very bad idea. In April 2020, I wrote about this, that chasing a viral outbreak with a vaccine has never been done before, and we would likely be outcompeted by the evolutionary power of the virus, which in aggregate provides a kind of biocomputation. That's why my associated channel is called biocomputation.org, and why this channel also has that in its name. A decade ago, there was an attempt to develop vaccines for SARS-CoV-1. They largely failed. A common result was this overactive immune response upon real infection, upon being challenged with a real infection. So creating a vaccine for a virus that kills by stimulating the immune system to attack the body is like planning to fight a fire with gasoline. Fortunately, the virus adopted to us much more quickly than our vaccines were able to chase it, as I predicted. So now it's a mild flu, which suggests that vaccines are of questionable value, especially risky vaccines like the mRNA technology, which I expected to be reviewed because billions of these doses of this new form of vaccine have been done, and the developers and the regulators have not addressed the glaring holes of the technology that exists today. The video that I mentioned goes into gross detail into the problems related to the packaging of the mRNA into lipid nanoparticles, and also the presence of self-amplifying regions. Now, together, they lead to complete lack of control of three key elements of any kind of quality drug or vaccine: biodistribution, dosing, and clearance. These are not only uncontrolled, but perhaps uncontrollable for the lipid nanoparticle, which goes everywhere, and the self-amplifying regions. This is obvious to any biochemist, but these fundamental questions appear to be swept under the rug by the emergency administration authorization. Now, that wasn't right at the time, but at least it seemed like they had an excuse, the urgency of the situation. Now, there is none. Now, the approval granted by two FDA agencies involved healthy children and was granted to the elderly and the sickly. They did not reference any of the challenges related to the vaccine technology that I just described. They are only looking at eliciting this serological response of in patients, and this post-marketing clinical trial, which they didn't even have the decency to mention in the approval letter because it's coming after the approval, involves 50 patients of each population, the elderly and those with risk factors. And they're only going to look at eliciting serological response. This is what I call a perfunctory clinical trial, pitiful number of patients being enrolled, completely unsuitable for a phase 3 trial. Now, an honest appraisal of this would be to call it a phase 4 clinical trial, which is to say post-marketing surveillance, but even that should be much more massive. They've given, and Pfizer proudly wrote about this, they've provided 5 billion doses to the public, and they're going to survey 100 people now. So this is putting the cart before the horse. there is an irony of this discussion, and that's that all of this mostly amounts to the question of financing. In other words, if you feel strongly enough, you can take your infant and give them this vaccine. And I looked through the VAERS system and saw some very sad notes about people for whom mortal events occurred. Looking for those 25 patients that the administration will be talking about. And yet, this is not even a question. It's only official approval and whether or not your insurance will pay for the shot if you go to the local CVS or Walgreens. So an officially recommended vaccine is one that can, basically provide insurance coverage, while others would simply be paying out of pocket, and they could even do that without consulting a doctor. And sometimes I've seen those cases as well. There was a consultation, and yet, terrible things happen. Let me go now to the discussions of the CDC panel and the questioning of the health secretary in the Senate. Specifically, as I mentioned, Senator Mark Warner was attempting to essentially refute reality regarding severe deficiencies of data collection with COVID vaccine. RFK Jr. could not commit to a specific number of COVID deaths, and Senator Warner would not accept this answer about abysmal data acquisition. He was projecting polarization on the data. As I mentioned, I reviewed data in the vaccine adverse event reporting system. I've done it in the article I posted in April 2024, about a year and a half ago, and I reviewed the data more recently. So back in the day, the data was even worse, but even now it's not really analyzed in any way, including basic questions like how many adverse events are occurring due to COVID vaccines compared to others. In 2023, this analysis was that over 60% was related to COVID vaccines and under 40% was everything else, which says something about the risk factors, right? But they're not being properly weighed now, and we don't have a systematic way of collecting them. So this, of course, is partially a responsibility of RFK Jr., but as I would describe below, perhaps we don't want the government to collect this data. Perhaps we need an independent source. So, but let me go back to the data. There is very poor reporting structure regarding the adverse events. The reports are unverified. Sometimes they're coming from physicians, sometimes family members, sometimes neighbors. Sometimes there are duplicates. Unfortunately, the nature of that adverse event is also not easily categorized, so it's very difficult to search for it. For example, to assess how many cardiovascular problems are caused versus neurological problems. This is a serious problem with unstructured data, and it results in inability to answer fundamental questions. So what is going on? Well, the evidence seems to show that the regulators are going to plow forward with maintaining the pretense that there are no risk factors. Although, again, it's going to be aired this week. But let me go back to the approval. The recent approval, as I said, lacks required evidence, and the regulators also are ignoring the problems with these vaccines in general. There's a link to the full-length video about this in the description. What is also unbelievable about this is that the approval involves surveillance, in other words, acquisition of the data after the fact. Now, it seems that the two parties, the healthcare department under RFK Jr. and the FDA regulators are talking past each other, which does not result in good policy. But now, as I mentioned, they're going to have to come to terms, and it's going to be very ugly. FDA and other organizations seem to have a strange fascination with giving this vaccine to healthy children. This is why the two clinical trials cited by the regulators pertain to healthy children. One involved about 12,000 children, another involved 3,700. Again, this is in contrast to the clinical trial, which is about to start at the end of the month for the elderly and those with risk factors, with 100 patients altogether. Now, healthy children have had very little risk of COVID, death from COVID, even in the early days. Now, these risks are completely minimal, and yet there are substantial risks from a vaccine, which are going to be discussed. But they're certainly not properly documented or quantified, and that makes it difficult to weigh these factors. Now, the RFK Jr. seemed to be more interested in, and I'm trying to be generous here in my projection of the reasoning for what happened. He seems to be interested in helping those with risks, those who have risks of severe disease or the elderly. So these are, individuals with diabetes or who may be smoking. Obesity is a risk factor. Testosterone is also a risk factor. It's actually quite a sexist disease, especially in the early days. There were 60% of the male population who experienced severe cases of COVID versus 40% for females. But I digress. These risk factors not only pertain to infection with COVID itself, but also affect response to the vaccine. I know from looking at the vaccine adverse event reporting system that one risk factor having to do with autoimmunity is certainly one that should eliminate people from having this vaccine being administered. But let me go back to this approval. So in May, Kennedy ordered health officials to stop recommending the shots for healthy children, saying that only people at high risk of complications of COVID or over age 65 need them. They didn't have that evidence in May, and they don't have it now, but they gave this approval at the end of August. Who are they? Two departments, CBER, CBER, which is a department overseeing biologics, and another group that oversees vaccine research with a very long name. So, but let's go back to discussions with Kennedy. So in May, he terminated recommendations for healthy children, but we have that data, and recommended it for the elderly. Again, I think they've been administering these shots, but they have not collected that data. Of course, there's a new strain that's more relevant for the fall of 2025. It's called LP.8.1. But back in May, not only did Kennedy change these recommendations, in absence of data, he also ousted every member of the vaccine panel and replaced them with his own picks. Now, I think there were many problems with recommendations the CDC issued earlier. Whether or not we can have confidence in his replacements is anybody's guess. I have not looked into those picks, but this is a subject matter that's now being discussed politically. Now, at the time, also the new panel advised parents to consult with a doctor before they're getting children vaccinated. That, to me, doesn't seem like going over the top. So perhaps they're not so extreme. Several top officials did feel that this panel is outrageous and resigned recently in late August, claiming that Secretary Kennedy has ignored established research and politicized vaccine safety. I believe everybody is politicizing it and they're not using their data. So it's a little bit of a cattle calling the pot black here. So speaking of which, despite the lack of data for the elderly and those at risk, the FDA approved vaccines for the Kennedy's preferred patients. And the required data will be acquired later. And this clinical trial is described in the lengthy video. So there you have it, the horse before the cart, the effect before the cause. But let me go back to the VAERS system and to the discussion which is now going to be airing with the Trump administration and the Senate. The VAERS system is co-managed by two US agencies, the CDC and the FDA. Now, they both use the system as a kind of early warning monitoring system for vaccine safety, and it really guides further investigations. So they see some risks, they investigate them. It's not really suitable for quantitative research or quantitative discussions, which seems to be the case now. It is quite amazing to see these two organizations who oversee healthcare allowing such shoddy data acquisitions, including this post-marketing surveillance that they're expecting from Pfizer with merely 100 patients. The quality of the data renders the database essentially unusable, certainly for the purposes that are being pushed now, quantitative discussions of 25 children. It's very difficult to identify and discuss this data, and certainly to appreciate the risks. How many reports are there? What is the population being sampled? Is this truly significant in the statistical sense? I mentioned the two regulatory oversight agencies, CBER and Vaccine Research, and one of them explicitly wrote about the need for this post-marketing data collection process. Well, actually, both agencies that oversee the regulatory approval, both agencies that provided regulatory approval required post-marketing data. Again, why provide permissions before collecting data? Isn't this against the raison d'etre of a regulator? When when an organization is clueless to the point of being indistinguishable from corruption, it may have an alternate agenda. In this case, we can surmise it. It includes CYA. They've already allowed this vaccine to be provided in billions of doses without proper initial regulation or oversight. So to admit now that vaccine is based on uncontrollable technology would be embarrassing, as would be denial of it to those with people at risk. Again, Health Secretary Kennedy wants to give it to those at risk, but the data does not exist. It should have been collected. Perhaps it wasn't the right strain, but this all goes to the rationale or irrationale of chasing these kinds of vaccines with seasonal updates, which I predicted in April 2020 when I wrote about how the virus is likely to outcompute us and how COVID is likely to acquire the kind of seasonal strain variation that we see with influenza. As I mentioned, the primary strain that's expected to be prevalent in the fall of 2025 is LP8.1, and it postdates the vaccines that have been accepted. Certainly, it was not used in terms of the spike protein sequence for developing of these vaccines, nor has it been assessed for effectivity for providing protection when earlier strains were prevalent. It couldn't have been. So once again, the data is to be acquired. What's notable about this strategy is that spike protein has been revealed to be one of the most highly mutagenic regions of the SARS-CoV-2 genome. This is not surprising. This is where the evolutionary pressure is most intense. So this is where the mutations are most frequently manifested. They occur all over the genome, but they are most advantageous in these regions that have evolutionary pressure. This means vaccines developed to target older strains are suboptimal for the current one. We've seen this with the earlier cases of Pfizer and Moderna vaccine that had their efficiency drop dramatically with Delta and then Omicron strains when the vaccines were developed for the original. So trying to predict and chase this is similar to flu and is quite questionable and counterproductive. And yet they're pushing it onto children, onto healthy children. They're pushing it onto the elderly and those with risks. And the data does not exist for the latter. And for the former, we are about to hear about the mortality cases. So as I mentioned, I wrote about this in April 2020 in the first biocomputation.org post. I'm not trying to say that I had amazing foresight here, quite the opposite. Any expert virologist or epidemiologist would know much more. What I'm talking about here is basic reasoning using facts that are fundamental. Any biochemist, essentially, worth their salt should be able to see this. So where were the regulators? Where were the scientists, the well-paid scientists in all of these companies? You can answer that question for yourself. But let me return to the data collection question that came up at the Senate hearing. Most of the COVID deaths, and this was the question that first set off Senator Warner as saying that health secretary doesn't know his data. Most of the deaths from COVID came from individuals with comorbidities. In fact, multiple comorbidities, 3 or more. We're talking diabetes, smoking, etc. It's really not a trivial matter to assign cause of death in these cases. So when objectively combining all these risk factors with an infection, yes, we can say that the infection broke the camel's back, but is it so different from a strong flu? Strong flu seasons have mortality increased threefold often, increased to regular flu season. And this is often fatal, unfortunately, to the elderly and those with preconditions. So how different was this situation? Again, the mortality from flu at the time went way down and mortality from COVID went way up. Was it a horrible epidemic, or was it a particularly bad case of a cold? So speaking of attempts to quantify what happened to those who received vaccines, an even worse situation exists. How many lives were saved? That's a very difficult question. It involves basically guesswork because we don't have very much of a placebo control arm. Now, there are some countries like Sweden that we can compare ourselves to where they did not force this kind of population-wide vaccination, and they actually had lower mortality from COVID than the United States, but that I've discussed in other videos. I don't want to dwell on that now, but suffice it to say, in the United States, it's difficult to be sure. This is why it was important for scientists to argue for control of placebo arms in COVID administration in the early days. But for emergency purposes, it was argued that treatment was so much more important than science and understanding. And as a result, we really don't have any kind of comparison. So this undermines analysis. Without this kind of acquired data, we simply don't know if 50% or 99.5% of those who received the vaccine would have survived anyways. You see, we know that at the time, mortality rate was maybe 2% initially, then it went down to 1%. It's a little bit more nuanced for those with pre-existing conditions. But again, how many of those who survived, who were given vaccine, versus how many of them would have survived if they were not? We simply don't have the data. And not only did they not collect it prior to the approval, they have not systematically collected it since. Pfizer administered billions of doses, and they haven't collected the data, neither has the CDC or VAERS. So there is going to be now this public litigation of the unfortunate 25 fatalities linked to COVID vaccines. This was first reported by Washington Post last week and has resulted in the stocks of these two companies, Pfizer and Moderna, dropping dramatically. On Friday, last Friday, they dropped by 3.9% for Pfizer and 7.4% for Moderna. Now, these discussions of mortalities in children, in healthy children who received COVID vaccines, are based on various data, and it's not entirely clear which IDs they're talking about. I've looked into this data and couldn't identify all of these patients. I did see some very visceral documented cases, but I couldn't find 25, so this is going to be another question. Now, there are several remarkable features about this discussion that I alluded to before. So let me elaborate on this, and this will be a great finish to this video. First, the existing data is hazy, and the public cannot be sure what exactly is being discussed. Simply saying we don't have the IDs of these anonymous individuals. It would be great if this data was provided, but I'm not expecting that kind of clarity and transparency. So it's going to be 25 needles in a haystack. That doesn't help to make a great argument. And consequently, the discussion is likely to draw attention to the fact that the data set is this haystack, and I'm being generous, it's a pile. And the adverse events associated with COVID have been carelessly documented and essentially not processed. We have all of these AI systems, and yet even minuscule processing that could take the age of the patient from the report column and move it onto the age column is not consistently done. So it's extremely lazy. And this doesn't inspire confidence in any of the parties involved. Second, it's likely to stoke anger of the public without a productive outlet. Now, let me provide a case, and this is anonymous, so I read it with all deference to the individual. This is literally a case, and I'm citing an ID, so you can go to 2024 and find this ID case in the VAERS reporting system and read the following. This is so wrong, and you all know you have a problem with the vaccine. Too many people have died and have severe side effects. You all destroyed mine and my family's lives, killed my wife, killed my daughter's mother, and grandchildren's grandmother. How many more families did you all destroy? Trying to get the medicine out without trials and checking for side effects and what it would do to people that are compromised with other illnesses. There will be accountability, accountability capitalized. Lawyers are going, end of quotation. Now, this is a case you have to feel terrible about. This individual lost his wife, and it devastated his family, and there will be no accountability. It's not possible to sue. The government has given carte blanche to all of these companies, and they are going to get away with it for now. But the story is not finished. This is where the litigation of these deaths partly comes in. I believe there will be years of recriminations, and there will be continued erosion of public trust, and it could make tens of billions earned from the vaccine appear as a short-term sugar high compared to long-term costs for the companies. And for regulators also, the implications of the loss of public trust are significant. But perhaps we are better off acquiring data independently. They can make decisions based on independently acquired data, but we need to be able to have data with adequate provenance. And I will be talking that in videos shortly. The third and final point here I want to make about this discussion of 25 fatalities is that if administration succeeds in this, it's going to sow doubt for the safety of this vaccine to children, but it would also raise concerns and obvious implications for the elderly and those with risk factors, which would raise the questions of why are those people being offered the vaccine, and people will go and look at the approval letters and see that the vaccine approval was based on approval based for healthy children. And we're now discussing 25, or we'll be discussing this week, 25 mortalities in healthy children. This doesn't seem to be helpful to the cause of the administration, Trump administration, that pushed for these vaccines in Project Warp Speed, that I, at the time, wrote about would not work out well, because normal vaccines take years and sometimes over a decade to develop. Trying to cram it into months means cutting a lot of corners. It means not acquiring data, not looking at risk factors, which is what's been done before, but it continues to be done. So if this discussion succeeds, it would raise the extra questions about the pros and cons for providing this vaccine for those at risk. Will they, in fact, be provided more benefits, or will they suffer side effects from the vaccine? And then what will cyber agencies say that explicitly wrote about their responsibility to consider risks and benefits when they gave their approval to the elderly and the sickly, while citing clinical trials for healthy children? It may turn out that a subset of individuals with risk factors are in fact of greater risk from the vaccine than from the COVID infection itself. What will these regulators say? From my own investigations and looking at the various data, I can pretty confidently say that autoimmune conditions are a disqualifier. So if you have a family history of those, I strongly recommend you talk to the doctor and avoid vaccines. But you've probably seen these effects by now. So these discussions are going to be continued in the Senate, and they're going to litigate it. And the rationale is unclear. I already mentioned that when the news broke on Friday, the shares of the two mRNA producing companies, Pfizer and Moderna, fell significantly. And so this line of inquiry seems to be, likely to sink the stocks of all those involved: the companies, the FDA, health secretary, and the Trump administration. Now, supposedly Trump officials plan to include the claim of these 25 fatalities in the discussion with these new advisors of the CDC committee. And it's regarding new vaccine recommendations, but it's not clear where that's going because the approval was just given. So this is a horrible mess that's going to showcase how flawed the very process is, as well as the details of information about these fatal cases, how it was acquired and submitted, how the VAERS system uses unverified reports, which can be submitted to anyone. And as I mentioned, I've seen everything from reports based on social media posts to neighbors. Despite this data having unproven provenance and lacking proper curation, the health agencies have been using it for guiding their future development. But this kind of discussion seems to be much more specific. So again, it's only going to reveal the shoddiness of the data. And I've looked into these documents quite thoroughly recently, couldn't find 25 fatalities in 2024 and 2025 in children. And I was trying to filter by all the ages and even looked for blanks for ages. So it's clear that the data is purely curated, in addition to being unverified. Ages of patients are often in the notes, as I've mentioned, but not in the age category. And so the data is very difficult to use. I also saw multiple unique IDs being given to what is obviously the same kind of report from a witness. And so it's uncertain how much of these reports are guided by emotion as opposed to actual experience. So there you have it. Regulators gave approval to COVID vaccine to those with risks, making it free to these individuals, but they've really not ascertained risks properly, either to those for whom it was approved, nor to healthy children, which will be discussed shortly. So the evidence of 2 clinical trials involving healthy children is being used and is being cited in, again, the approval for the elderly and the sickly, which is a non sequitur. So why is this being cited at all? Well, I guess they have to cite something, and they're giving approval. They can't give it to healthy children, the approval, because because Secretary Kennedy is against it. So they're giving it to those with comorbidities. So it's a logical mess, and the situation is bizarre both physically and politically. Consequently, where do we stand with consequence in the CDC and the FDA, or the politicians who want to talk about data collection related to vaccines? They could have pushed for better data surveillance, post-marketing surveillance, clinical phase phase 4 clinical trials administered, again, in billions of doses by Pfizer, but this was not done. So now they're trying to act all like they're simply trying to adjudicate the situation when they had the power to impact it. And I think it's going to impact all their reputations as this dirty laundry is being aired. And I am sorry for using this analogy to talk about a topic so grave, but I think it captures the essence of what's going to happen this week. It's really unclear why they're going to basically provide us this powerful illustration for the cause that we're championing, namely the ownership of personal data by individuals and what I call separation of health and state, which can result in validated data being acquired and then used by the government and corporations. So I have links to the full-length video that talks about the COVID vaccine approval and covers posts that I made from 18 months and years ago and goes into the detail of the sad state of VAERS data. And as usual, if you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe.